Good afternoon. And welcome to the Triennial Ethel LeFrak Holocaust Education Conference. I am Mary Finger, president of Seton Hill University, and I welcome those who are here with us in the Performing Arts Center, as well as those who are with us through the streaming option. This is a hybrid version, and we're very happy to be able to offer this so we have as many people participating as possible. Right now, I'd like to ask University Chaplain, Monsignor Roger Statnick, to open with a prayer.
O God of light, we search for you amidst the darkness of our world, darkness arising from war, injustice, prejudice, factionalism, neglect of creation, and the hopelessness all these bring. Break through this darkness with words that enlighten, comradeship that breaks barriers, created beauty that heals, and courage that reorders our judgment about what is fair and who we are to each other. We remember this afternoon the words written by those caught in the darkness of the Holocaust. Help us find in them warnings against our complacency, guidance for our direction, and encouragement to shout against the darkness, no matter how overwhelming it may seem. Divine light of the nations, shine on all peoples of the earth. Let us see through you the dignity of every human person. Let us be your messengers, carrying your light into every effort we make to transform the world. Join us as brothers and sisters that others may see how your love makes us one. Holy God, may your holiness shine brightly on us, making us instruments of your light. We pray these blessings as we bless you, now and forever. Amen.
Thank you, Father Roger. The theme for the 2024 Ethel LeFrak Holocaust Education Conference is Telling the Stories, Narrative in Holocaust and Genocide Education. We are grateful to have here today our keynote speaker, Alexandra Zapruder, author of Salvaged Pages, Young Diarists, the Holocaust, and the Historical Record. During the conference, the National Catholic Center for Holocaust Education at Seton Hill aims to provide educators with the tools they need to teach about the Holocaust and other genocides through a storytelling lens. Stories passed down from generation to generation are powerful. Indeed, here at Seton Hill, we have been privileged to hear and share the stories of Holocaust survivors. Now we are hearing from the children of survivors, who are working to ensure their parents' experiences are heard by young people today and for years to come. I want to take this opportunity to thank the LeFrak family for their continued support of this conference and of the National Center for Holocaust Education. The LeFraks embrace opportunities to better the lives of others. Their generosity has been recognized by many institutions, including the Guggenheim, Temple Emmanuel on New York's Fifth Avenue, the University of Maryland, the Pratt Institute, New York Presbyterian Hospital, the Metropolitan Opera, and the Smithsonian. Ethel LeFrak, our benefactor, was a cherished friend of Seton Hill, and we are delighted today to share a video message from her daughter, Francine LeFrak, who has carried on her mother's spirit of generosity and keen interest in the work of the Holocaust Center. Francine is the president of the Francine A. LeFrak Foundation and the Same Sky Foundation Fund. A successful social entrepreneur, women's rights advocate, and philanthropist, Francine founded a trade initiative, Same Sky, to help women who were invisible become visible through the dignity of work. Her work with Same Sky began with survivors of the Rwandan genocide and continued in the U.S. with women who were recently released from prison. Please turn your attention to the screen for the video message from Francine LeFrak.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to the Ethel LeFrak Holocaust Education Conference. It's an honor to speak to all of you and focus on the powerful theme of the conference, storytelling and the Holocaust. In today's world, where we face a tremendous rise in anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred, the stories we share can lead to pathways and connections to educate each other, to be a part of this important work. So let's lean into the stories. My mother, Ethel LeFrak, was a passionate advocate for education and had a very special bond with Seton Hill, especially through her friendships with Sister Gemma and the late President Emeritus, Joanne Boyle. Their dedication to uncovering the stories of the Holocaust and confronting the roots of hatred emboldened their passion and commitment to creating this very conference. My mother was so proud of this work, and I am inspired by my mother's legacy and your dedication to listening and sharing stories. As you engage over the next few days in storytelling, I encourage you to remember the impact your narrative can have. Every person has a story that deserves to be remembered and told, and no longer hidden. In every generation, we share even our most uncomfortable history, which we need to pass on through generation to generation, so that we can continue to learn from the past and be sure not to repeat it. I know my mother is watching this conference with pride and is grateful to all of you for your hard work and dedication. Thank you all.
Thank you, Francine, for sharing your message today. I know it will resonate with the attendees of the conference. Now I'd like to ask Jim Paharic, Director of the National Catholic Center for Holocaust Education, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Well, thank you, President Finger, and let me also extend my welcome to everyone who's here, both in the auditorium and online. We've been planning this conference for a long time and are very excited to have our keynote speaker, Alexandra, with us today. And it's my pleasure to introduce her. So Alexandra Zapruder is a graduate of Smith College and also Harvard University. And she began her career as a member of the founding staff of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. It's a wonderful job to have as a young professional. And in those early days, she was serving on the team that curated an exhibit called Remember the Children, Daniel's Story. You can still see this exhibit today, by the way. It's a wonderful exhibition. And in the process of working on that and doing the research for it, she discovered some of the diaries that would later make their way into this book that she'll be talking about today, Salvaged Pages. And it's an award-winning book, and it's been used by many, many teachers for many years, myself included. And so we'll be hearing more about that book and why it's such a wonderful resource for teachers this afternoon. Now, in addition to compiling the book, Alexandra has curated an exhibit for the Houston Holocaust Museum titled "And I Still Write: Young Diarists on War and Genocide." That exhibition opened in 2019. And then in 2020, during the COVID pandemic, she launched a project called Dispatches from the Quarantine, which offered young people an opportunity to document their experiences of life during that time. And as part of that project, she published an online gallery showcasing their contributions in prose, poetry, photography, art, and song. So you see a theme emerging here, the focus on young people and helping to provide them with opportunities to share their stories and to read the stories of others. In the years since Salvaged Pages was first published, and that's about a little over 20 years ago now, it's hard to believe, it's gained a wide audience among teachers. The documentary that's called I Still Write is based on the book, and that's made her work even more accessible to teachers and to students alike. Alexandra has also produced related educational materials, materials that supplement the diaries in the book, and those are very useful as well. I've actually used those, again, with my own students. A number of you here in the audience are students in my graduate course, local teachers who have joined us, and we not only read the book as a class, but used some of these ancillary materials. So I have to say it's an exciting day for me, because when I first envisioned the theme of this conference, narratives, using narrative to learn about the Holocaust and genocide, I realized that I needed to invite Alexandra to speak to us, to be our keynote speaker. Her book is really the preeminent resource, I believe, in this field of narratives to understand the Holocaust and to augment the wonderful Anne Frank diary that so many schools continue to use. This book contains diaries that expand on the story that Anne Frank told. There are people in very different situations than Anne Frank was in ghettos, on the way to the death camps, young people writing their stories, even under those most extreme conditions. And so to read, the least we can do, I think, is to read their words and to learn from what they wrote firsthand, these eyewitness reports of what they experienced. So I've been teaching about the Holocaust for many years now. I'm a sociologist, which maybe is a good thing in some ways a limitation perhaps. I like to look at the macro picture. I look at economic and political and cultural forces that lie behind the rise of the Nazi regime. And so it's important to get that overall picture, but it's also important to hear the stories of people who were directly affected. And one of the things my students have taught me over the years is that those stories speak to us in a way that no secondary account can do. Those firsthand stories of people in the midst of these cataclysmic events, to read their words, they're often incredibly insightful and articulate words, is a very moving and rewarding experience. The diaries that are in Salvaged Pages have historical significance, it's true, but they also have a literary value. Many of the writers really had a facility for using language to convey their experiences. So we can read them both as scattered historical accounts, but also as documents that have a literary worth. And every time I read these diaries again and I teach the book, I end up with a feeling that I have a deeper understanding of the experiences of these young people. And it makes me interested in learning about young people in other times and places, including in our world today, who are living under horrific and life-threatening conditions. So as I use this book with my students, it can be a bit of a struggle at times. Some parts of the book are painful to read, and yet my students have invariably told me that they were enriched by reading these diaries. It changed their lives in ways that few things that we can read about that period can do. And it instills in all of us, I think, a desire to do all we can to create a more compassionate and peaceful world. So it is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome Alexandra Zapruder.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Jim, for that very lovely welcome. Thank you, President Finger, and the National Catholic Center for Holocaust Education and Seton Hill for having me here today. I'm so glad to see you all. And to those of you who are online, wherever you are, hello. I believe deeply in narrative. In fact, although it's perhaps a risky thing to say in this context, it's practically a religion for me. I believe so deeply that stories are the way that we make sense of the world. It's how we understand what has happened to us, the past, how we construct a vision for the future. And so I'm particularly pleased to be here and to talk about narrative in the context of young writers' diaries, because these writers wrote themselves into existence at a time and in a place where everything was conspiring to erase them. That is perhaps the most important thing to remember, that writing can be a way to construct one's place in the world. I want to begin by talking a little bit about my narrative and how I got here, how I came to devote the majority of my career to this work. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how Salvaged Pages came to be, the research to collect and find these diaries, and then try to offer you a framework for thinking about what they represent. And then I have a number of diary entries that I'm going to read, each of which illustrates a different sort of facet of the body of material. So as Jim said, I was very fortunate to be hired fresh out of college at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum as a researcher. This was in 1991, and I was hired in spite of the fact that I actually knew nothing about the Holocaust. I had not studied it. I did not have a degree. My degree was in art history and French literature, a slightly more optimistic field perhaps, but that's what I loved. But I had a strong background and grounding in research. And so I was hired because the museum needed a researcher to help really delve into the stories of young people in order to construct the exhibition that became Remember the Children, Daniel's Story, that some of you may have seen. And among many other things that I was asked to do, I was tasked with having a look at diaries that had been kept by teenagers at the time. And this was because the exhibition was written in the form of a diary. So the text is told in this Daniel's diary. Daniel's the central character of this exhibition. And so in order to get a sense of what kinds of things young people wrote about and what the way that they wrote about their lives, we thought we should look at real diaries. So I went back and I reread the Diary of Anne Frank, which I had read in the 7th grade. And then I went to the museum's library, and at this time, I just have to sort of create a little picture for you. This was before the building was open. There was no museum yet. The museum was under construction, and the staff was in in an office building on L Street in Washington, surrounded by lawyers and lobbyists, and we were in these suites kind of scattered all around this building. And so the library really wasn't a library, it was an office suite, and there were stacks of books and boxes, and it was all very under construction, let's say. And the librarian at the time was Bill Connolly, who was a tremendous character of blessed memory, who knew every book in the collection. And I went to him and I said, I need to have a look at, are there any other diaries that anybody kept during the Holocaust, any other teenagers? And he had already done the first round of research on this topic. I don't know by what prescience he did that, but he went out and sort of rummaged around and came back with this stack of published diaries. So there were at the time about, I would say 7, let's say, or 8 diaries that had been translated into English, published in single editions in English, and then had almost immediately gone out of print. And there were a few other diaries that had been published in larger collections. So the material was there, but it was not accessible particularly, certainly not accessible the way that Anne Frank's diary was accessible. So I took these diaries back to my office and I started to read. And I've given, I've spoken about this book for more than 20 years, and every time I say the same thing because it's true. I nearly fell off my chair when I started reading this. I could not believe what I was reading. The first diary that I read was the diary of Yitzhak Rudashevsky, who I'll read from later. And his words were so beautiful, so profound, so thought-provoking, so different, so modern, so something that felt like it could have been written, a few years before, not decades before. And so insightful. There were so many new ideas about what it meant to live in this moment, as it was recorded in real time. So I continued to work my way through the diaries, and I thought, how is it possible that not only that I didn't know that these diaries existed, I wasn't the world's leading expert on the Holocaust, so that wasn't surprising. What was surprising was that it had never occurred to me that anybody other than Anne Frank had written a diary. Millions of children and young people perished in the Holocaust or survived. And it never occurred to me that there was one other diary besides her diary, which just on the face of it, as a math problem, even for somebody like me who's not really very good at math, it seems implausible. And I started to think, why is that? Why does Anne's diary loom so large? And what is it about these other diaries? Why do they sort of languish in obscurity? Is there a body of material here? Are there themes that run through the whole thing? Are there ways in which their diaries are like her diary? Are there ways in which her diary is genuinely different from all of these records? And above all, are there more diaries like this out there? Or is this just a tiny little handful that somehow surfaced from the cataclysm and that's all that is left? And so, partly thanks to my very, very good liberal arts education, I knew that I had questions, and I knew that my questions were worth asking. And so, alongside my job at the Holocaust Museum, I began to research the subject, reading everything I could about the Holocaust, reading everything I could about children, and beginning to track references to diaries that came up in various histories. The other thing that happened was that I was very lucky to be on the founding staff of the museum at a moment when people were donating their materials to the museum. Every major historian of the Holocaust was associated with the museum in some way. If I had a question about what archive to consult in Poland, there were historians who would tell me. There were people who would help. There were the collections, that contained primary source material that was being donated to the museum. There was the oral testimony, the oral history department, where people were giving their testimonies. And over time, as the years went on and my colleagues began to learn of my interest in this subject, I found myself getting an occasional call. Something's just been, a teenager's diary has just been donated to the museum. Do you want to come down and have a look at it? A friend would call from the oral history department. Somebody gave a testimony. I just came across a reference to a teenager's diary. Would you like to learn more? And so over the next 10 years, part of that time at the Holocaust Museum, part of that time in graduate school, then back at the Holocaust Museum, I began to accumulate these records. By the time Salvaged Pages came out, there were more than 55 diaries that I had identified. Now it's probably closer to 85 or 90. And that does not include diaries that were written by non-Jewish teenagers during World War II. It is a tiny fragment of the lives that were lost, but it is a vast amount of material to contend with, thousands and thousands of pages in many, many different languages, written by young people from all different kinds of circumstances. And so I want to talk a little bit both about the range of material and also how to wrap our arms around that range of material and how to make some kind of sense of it so that it doesn't just feel like this enormous mass that we can't apprehend. So certainly, in terms of range, they represent and come from almost every country that you can think of in Europe. They're written in nearly every language you can imagine. They are written by young people who were as young as 12 and teenagers or those just on the cusp of adulthood, let's say 20 or 21. There are big families and there are small families. There are only children. There are Orthodox Jewish teenagers. There is a young boy who was converted to Catholicism and was a practicing Catholic who is still alive and well, an amazing man called Peter Feigl, who I love dearly, who wrote his diary, both hiding and as a refugee, as a Catholic, even though he was being persecuted as a Jew, and everywhere in between. Jews who had no connection to their religious background but were deeply connected to the Jewish community or very culturally and ethnically identified with Judaism. There are children who were the product of a mixed marriage, so one Jewish parent and one non-Jewish parent, again, and everything in between. The levels of education vary. There were kids from big cities and rural areas. There were kids who were from wealthy families and from incredibly poor families. There were young people who had incredible educations who referenced Dante and Shakespeare and Goethe in their diaries, and there are young people who barely had a command of Polish. Politically, everywhere along the spectrum. So one of the things that happened as I began to collect this material was, in some ways, I was looking for diversity. I wanted diversity. That was a big part of what I was after. But it also meant that every time a new diary came along, it sort of broke any effort that I could have to generalize about what the material is, because there would always be something new that would say, oh, this doesn't really fit into this picture, now I have to reevaluate the whole thing. And there were certain outliers. For example, there's a diary of a teenager who was a refugee, but instead of fleeing west, like 99.9% of the refugee diaries, she was fleeing east into the interior of Russia. There's a diary of a girl who wrote in Romania. Well, the Holocaust in Romania was its own entity. It was its own experience. It was very different in many ways from what the Holocaust was like for those who were living in Poland, for example, or Lithuania or Latvia. There was a diarist who was a member of the privileged class of the ghetto in Kovno ghetto, who I often say was the diarist who all the other diarists would have hated, because he really had access to things that the average ghetto dweller would never have. And so his experience is different, but we have that window. So the wealth of it and the range of it and the diversity of it is for sure part of its great power. But then we have to ask ourselves, how do we organize it? How do we make sense of it? How do we get our arms around it? The existing framework for understanding diaries of this period was, of course, the Diary of Anne Frank. She created the genre, she perfected the genre, and she looms enormously large over the genre to this day, and will always do so. And the framework for her diary is a remarkably simple and straightforward one. It is as follows. It is a redemptive framework. Anne Frank poured her heart and soul into her diary. She preserved something essential of herself in her diary, because that's what a diary is and that's what a diary does, according to the sort of most general thinking about it. And therefore, the survival of her diary is almost like the survival of Anne Frank. She almost can be said to have triumphed over death because she wrote this diary and it survived. Number 2, Anne Frank was so eloquent, so articulate, such an amazing spokesperson that it is as if she speaks for all the children who perished. One writer who becomes the voice of millions. And in this way, they too are redeemed from death, because they too live on through the power of her words. And finally, that Anne Frank's faith in humanity, her optimism, her belief that people were really good at heart, redeems us all from the evil that took place and that took her life and the lives of many millions. Right? That she somehow, even if she could affirm her faith in humanity, given the circumstances that she was in, who are we to argue? I think it's important that had it not been the early 1990s, had it not been post-Bosnia and Rwanda, had it not been the moment that it was, and had I not been at the Holocaust Museum, I might not have seen through that framework quite in the way that I did. But to me, immersed in these stories, and I will say, although it is somewhat personal, deeply grieving as I did so, that framework and that language felt hollow to me. It felt like a way of avoiding what was true. They don't live on. I wish they did, but there is no living on. How could any text, even if it was 500 pages long, stand in for a life, for the complexity of a life, for all the things that aren't written and all the things that aren't said? How could one voice ever stand in for the millions? That's sort of to deny, in a way, the ultimate tragedy of genocide, is that those lives are lost and gone and they can never be recaptured, and no one can even symbolically stand in for them. And finally, is it not irresponsible of us to not read this history and grapple with its moral implications rather than leaning on one thing that one young girl said one time in her diary, and to have it become the tagline, our consolatory protection against confronting the truth of what the Holocaust really means and what it tells us? But that left me with a really, really, really big problem, because it's all well and good to dismantle a paradigm, but then you have to come up with something else. What is the paradigm going to be for understanding this material? And Jim said it. You know, it came really from an understanding of how adult diaries were read at the time. That is to say, adult diaries of the Holocaust, of which there are many, were always read as historical and literary sources. They were always used to understand the complexity of day-to-day life, and to understand and create a timeline or a chronology or a record to delve into the complexity of the experience. And for those writers who were very writerly, they were read as literature. Why shouldn't young writers' diaries be given the same benefit, be understood the same way? Why can't we restore to them the meaning of what they did, not what we want them to represent, not what is going to comfort us, but rather to see them as the true, significant historical and literary records that they are, even though, and perhaps because, they were young people who chose to write about their lives. So with that, what I want to do is talk about diaries as history, diaries as literature, and then I have a few other kind of frameworks that I'm gonna offer you to think about. One of the things that I want to say about this is that as history and as literature and as any large body of material, the diarists not only contradict Anne Frank in some ways, but they contradict each other, and they contradict themselves, as people are prone to do. People are complicated. People don't believe the same thing on Tuesday and Thursday, let alone when they are in the most extreme circumstances. And I believe so deeply that if there is one thing we have never needed more, it is to teach our students to tolerate nuance, to tolerate complexity and contradiction, to be able to hold in their minds ideas that that directly contradict each other, but that might both be true in some kind of fundamental way. And I think one of the great strengths of teaching this material is that it allows us to reject binary, simplistic, reductive thinking. There is not just one narrative. There is not just one way to interpret this history. There are a multiplicity of them, and sometimes they are directly in contradiction with each other, and that is good. It is good for our brains and our hearts and our spirits to be able to grapple with that and contend with that. So, to begin with history, I want to just very briefly say that the diaries in Salvaged Pages and out of Salvaged Pages break out into three broad categories. There are diaries that were written by young people who were refugees. These are, generally speaking, as I said, young people who were, let's say, in Germany, Austria, and the Czech lands, who were fleeing westward to England or to America, in some cases to what was then Palestine, in search of safety. And these are diaries that are really about alienation, loss of language, loss of family, loss of culture, the logistics of trying to get out, the mechanics, loss of home, the story of the refugee. And for those of you who teach young people who are recent arrivals to this country, I think you'll find that there's a great deal in this particular body of material, which has, this area has been somewhat neglected, that really speaks to young people today, especially young people who have had that experience. Then there are diaries by young people who wrote in hiding, either literally in hiding like Anne Frank or passing as non-Jews, and there are just a handful of those, meaning that they had false identity papers and they were somehow visible and in the world, but they were shielded by their false identity papers. And then the majority were written by young people who were in ghettos or directly under occupation. They were trying to survive under the heel of Nazism with all of the enormous complexity that that brought, and I will come back to that subject. But even more broadly, diaries, and we all know this, diaries are primary sources, right? They're different from memoir. What makes them different and what makes them special is that they're all about place and time. They're written in a certain moment, in a certain place, across time, without a knowledge of what was to happen in the end. So a memoir, written after the war, the story's been told, and one can create a narrative arc, a beginning, middle, and end. But in the moment, there were ups, there were downs, there were all kinds of setbacks, there were good moments, there were bad moments, but you don't have that neat and tidy narrative arc that we're all so accustomed to. And as a result, these capture the details of daily life, the nuances that absolutely get forgotten over time. And I think about this all the time because, and it's true of anybody who writes a diary, not just these writers, you write what means something to you that day, that moment, what is paramount in your mind. But that might be something that can illuminate an experience, but you could entirely forget about it years later. And the example that I always give is this young writer in Lodz Ghetto, a girl who wrote in her diary, this time of, I'm going to come back to her diary, but time of terrible starvation and hunger, and she wrote in her diary, mother bought a scale for 8 marks. So her mother spent money on a kitchen scale. Why? Because the family was starving and everybody had to have the same amount of food in order to ensure the highest likelihood that everyone would have the same chance of survival. That's a little tidbit. She didn't dwell on it, she didn't interpret it, it was what happened that day, but it tells us so much. And that's the kind of detail that we're always looking for in these diaries. Where's the nuance? Where's the little thing that's easy to overlook but actually opens a window into our ability to understand this, this moment? So they have varying levels of historical significance, as documents do. Some have a lot, some don't have as much, but they all tell us something. And at the same time, they have their limits. Unlike a memoir, not only didn't they know what was going to happen, they were very often had very partial and often faulty information about what was happening outside in the outside world. Events hadn't happened yet, so there was no full understanding of how things were unfolding. For example, some writers were writing having no idea of the larger genocide that was taking place around them. They knew what was happening locally, but they didn't know that Auschwitz existed, for example, or Bergen-Belsen, or the incredible universe of concentration camps. So they're writing with that limited vantage point, and we always have to hold that in our minds and remember. So today is the 86th anniversary of what's called the Reichspogromnacht, or some of you may know it as Kristallnacht, which of course was a pogrom that took place in Germany and Austria on November 9th and 10th, 1938. And I thought because of that, I would read from, as an example of the sort of historical detail and the texture of daily life and the way that it's preserved in diaries, I would read from the diary of Klaus Langer, who was a Jewish boy writing in Essen, Germany, who documented his experience of the Reichspogromnacht. So I want you to listen to this and all of the diary entries that I'm going to read from the vantage point of how your students might hear it. What kinds of details might they glean, specificity that has meaning and value. So this is November the 11th, 1938, and Klaus was 14. The past 3 days brought significant changes in our lives. On November 7th, a German legation member was assassinated in Paris. He died 2 days later. On November 10th came the consequences. At 3 o'clock, the synagogue and the Jewish Youth Center were put on fire. Then they began to destroy Jewish businesses. During the morning, private homes were also being demolished. Fires were started at single homes belonging to Jews. At 6:30 in the morning, the Gestapo came to our house and arrested father and mother. Mother returned after about an hour and a half. Dad remained and was put in prison. Bobby was at the synagogue and the youth center in the morning and saw how they burned. Later, we went to the daycare center where the children had been brought from the community home, which they had had to flee during the night. We returned to our neighborhood by 2 o'clock. Not far from us, we saw a gang vandalizing a home, throwing things out of the window. When I turned into the front yard, I saw that the house was damaged. I walked on glass splinters. I ran into our apartment and found unbelievable destruction in every room. It was the same in the apartment of the caretaker below us. Mother and grandmother were there. My parents' instruments were destroyed. The dishes were broken. The furniture was broken. Windows smashed. The desk turned over. Drawers and mirrors shattered. And the radio smashed. Books could be written about all that happened and about which we now begin to learn more, but I have to be careful. A new regulation was issued that the Jews of Germany had to pay 1 billion Reichsmarks for restitution. What for? For the damage the Nazis had done to the Jews in Germany. So I hope you can see, and that is just one part of even two very, very long entries with a lot more detail, about how you could use that and lay that alongside a historical source for your students as a way to really get into the details. Not only what did he experience and what did he feel himself, but what happened to his belongings, his household, his family, his friends. And I think it brings it down to this much more personal and detailed kind of realm that I think is very, very, very helpful. So I want to talk now about literary records, because, I could talk about historical records and primary sources forever, but I don't have forever. I wish I could trap you all here and keep you, but I can't do that. So I'm going to switch and talk a little bit about literary records. Not every record is a literary record in the sense that not every writer had those aspirations. And one of the things that I found so interesting about these diaries is that there is a sort of assumption that diaries are personal and that diaries are private, right? That's sort of what we think of as a diary, is that it's a private, personal account that's not meant to be shared with the outside world. But one of the things, and there were so many things in this work, so many assumptions that were challenged, one of them was that many young writers did view their diaries as personal and did view their diaries as private, but not everyone did. There's really quite a range. And so for what it's worth, I'll offer you sort of 3 lenses for thinking about that dimension and the literary, the way that young writers use writing to document their experiences. The first is the sort of internal world, right? The idea that the most classic interpretation of a diary, the private self. This is about my own life, my feelings, my relationships, my love, falling in love with a boy, my faith in God, my understanding of my identity, my hopes for the future. This is about what's inside me. And those tend to be very reflective and meditative, and you'll hear some diary entries later on that really capture that voice. That's what we think of when we think of Anne Frank's diary, right? Writing about her mother and her sister and her love for Peter, her own interior life. But then you have a diary like Klaus Langer. That's really not very much about his feelings. He's really reporting on what happened around him. And so the next widest lens after the interior or internal one is the immediate world. What's happening immediately around me to myself and my family? These tend to be diaries that have a reporting kind of quality that's really not so much about feelings. It's much more about what is actually happening to us. And you see writers oftentimes toggle between these kinds of lenses, but that it's very important for some writers, particularly someone like Klaus, to be very precise and very specific about documenting what happened to him and his family. And he's not talking about anybody outside of their world. And then, in this diary that I'm going to read to you next, represents the third world, or the third lens, which is the external lens. It's the most literary. It's really the broadest. It is what is happening to us collectively, not just me and my family and our day-to-day lives, but what is the story of the Jewish people in this moment? Us in the ghetto, us in the deportation, column, us in the bigger scheme of this large and overwhelming effort to destroy the Jewish people. And those tend to be the most literary. And writers really do move between these lenses in their diaries. Some stay mostly in one, some stay mostly in another, and some go back and forth. This one is the diary of Yitzhak Rudashevsky, who I mentioned earlier, who's a real favorite of mine, and he's sort of the classic chronicler. He was someone who wrote very little, actually, about himself. Not never, but very little. But mostly he was interested in documenting what was happening to the ghetto, the Vilna ghetto as a whole, which is where he was living, in Vilna ghetto. He was an only child living with his parents. And this is an entry that he wrote on October the 2nd, 1942. And as I read it, I'll ask you to think about how different it sounds from Klaus's diary. He's writing about the ruins on the street in the ghetto and referring to a period of time in the ghetto from September of 1941 to December of 1941, when the Germans were culling the Jewish population of the Vilna ghetto, taking away those who couldn't work, the elderly, the infirm, and murdering them in the Ponar forest. And then those people who survived that period went into the Vilna ghetto, which then had about a little less than a year and a half of the so-called quiet period, during which time there were no deportations. And there was a tremendous cultural life that Rudashevsky was a part of. So this is his reflection on the ruins and what they remind him of when he walks by them. So this is Friday, October 2nd, 1942. I am almost well now. I walk around in the street. Since new districts that border on our Disner Alley have been added to our ghetto, and since our little street is full of ruins that run through the whole of Yatkever Street, these ruins are being torn down. Now demolished walls stand. In the daytime, you can see blue sky, and at night, the stars through the black holes that served as windows. Strange feelings come over me as I look at the black ruins, shattered by the bloody storm that used to sweep over our ghetto. I look at the black holes, at the fragments of stoves. How much tragedy and anguish is mirrored in every shattered brick, in every dark crack, in every bit of plaster with a piece of wallpaper. Here the murderers, the Lithuanians, broke in like animals with axes and with crowbars and sought their prey. Through here, hungry people used to crawl outside the ghetto and bring in some food. Here in the ruins, the people, like enraged animals hunting for prey, broke and pierced the walls, tearing boards to cook their meager midday meal. Here, Germans stood and laughed at the horror, and Jews walked around near the ruins and bit their lips until they bled in misery and shame. Here on the black walls is inscribed in blood and tears all our tragedy and pain. As I look at the ruins, an uncanny feeling comes over me to see how Jews putter around there. I too crawl between the bricks, pieces of wallpaper, tiles, and it seems to me a lamentation ascends from the black crevices, from the stale holes. It seems to me that the ruins are weeping and importuning, as though lives were hidden here. There's so much to say about this entry. You know, in some ways, Yitzhak is able to illuminate the relationship between the perpetrator, the victim, and the collaborator, right? The Germans are not blooding their hands, they're laughing. The Lithuanians are carrying out the roundups and the raids, and the Jews are helpless and humiliated. But even more than that, and he names the Lithuanians. He says, the Lithuanians, they are the ones who did this, not the Germans. And it's important that that's another, like the scale, it's a little, he didn't go on a big discourse about it, but it's there, and we have to contend with it. But even more than that, Rudashevsky is writing here about how the space, how the physical place holds the memory of what took place there. That it is sort of a metaphor for what is left of the Jewish community. The ruins stand. They're fragments, they're broken, they're falling down, but they are still here. And he writes, you know, that he's going around and it's kind of almost trying to find the experiences that are held there and the way that this particular place kind of is a witness, even if he and others are not there to be witnesses in the end. And I always think when I read this entry about memorials and about how and why we make memorials the way that we do and how different it is to stand where something happened. There's a reason we go to Auschwitz. There's a reason we go to Ground Zero. There's a reason we go to these places because they hold something of the experience that another place simply doesn't have. And he's beginning, I think, to kind of grapple with that in this entry. So I want to talk for a minute about adolescence because, you know, they're not just diaries of teenagers and they're the same as diaries of adults. They're not the same any more than teenagers are like adults, and I can say this because I have two of them and they're not at all like adults. God bless them. You know, we know that teenagers, young people, are constructing their identities. That's what's happening developmentally in adolescence, right? There's a certain number of things that you inherit. Your religion, your family culture, your values, your nationality, your language. And adolescence is a time of grappling with all of those things and deciding, what am I going to keep, what am I going to reject, of constructing the self. And that work happens regardless of what else is happening. There's no opting out of that phase of life. So whether it's the Holocaust or not, and whatever else they are doing in their diaries, they are also going through this process and leaving traces of that very tumultuous, very difficult period of identity formation. For them, that identity formation was complicated by the fact that one part of their identity constituted a mortal threat. Being Jewish was, you know, in the absence of all other things, a death sentence. And so many young writers actually grappled with that very thing, about some more explicitly than others, but, you know, really thinking about what does it mean to be a Jew? How do I relate to that part of my identity? Some rejected it, some embraced it, some remained neutral, but they were all aware of it, and it comes through in a great many diaries. So I want to read the diary of a girl who, until very recently, has been known as the anonymous girl from Lodz Ghetto. Ever since I started this work, she was known as the anonymous girl. And just this past week, I heard from an amazing researcher called Eva Viator, who lives in Lodz, Poland, who found out her name. So I will share with you that her name was Minia Cooper. She had a brother and sister who astonishingly survived the Holocaust, something that none of us knew. And she wrote in Lodz at a time of terrible, terrible hunger. Her diary is really almost entirely about death by starvation and the struggle to survive. And one of the things that really emerges from her diary is the totally reductive nature of life with hunger. That there's a way in which the body and the brain and the heart and the soul and the spirit, everything is constantly focused on food and how to get food and how to nourish the body. And it is a particular kind of torture. So I'm going to read this entry that she wrote, and then I'm going to say a couple words about it. It'll make more sense if I read it first, about how her adolescence is really reflected in this particular text. So this is Wednesday, March 11th, 1942, Minia Cooper. This ration is much worse than the previous one. Terrible hunger is awaiting us again. I got the vegetable ration right away. There is only vinegar and ice and the beets. There is no food. We are going to starve to death. All my teeth ache and I am very hungry. My left leg is frostbitten. I ate almost all the honey. What have I done? I'm so selfish. What are they going to put on their bread now? What will they say? I must have a heart of stone. I'm ruthless. I eat everything I can lay my hands on. Today I had a fight with my father. I swore at him, even cursed him. It happened because yesterday I weighed 20 decagrams of noodles and then sneaked a spoonful. When my father came back, he immediately noticed that some noodles were missing. My father started yelling at me, and he was right. I became very upset and cursed my father. I regret it so much, but it can't be undone. My father is not going to forgive me. How will I ever look him in the eyes? He stood by the window and cried like a baby. Not even a stranger has ever insulted him before. We would be a happy family if I didn't fight with everybody. All the fights are started by me. I must be manipulated by some evil force. I would like to be different, but I don't have a strong enough will. There is nobody I can talk to. Why isn't there anybody who would guide me? Why can't anybody teach me? I hate my sister. She is a stranger to me. God, show me what is right. So if Klaus's diary is sort of the immediate world, and Yitzhak's diary shows you an example of this broader picture, this is a sort of classic example of this interior kind of voice, right? She's really grappling with what is fundamentally for her a moral dilemma, and that is the body needs to be fed. You can't argue with that. Hunger is an overpowering force. And yet, in order to adhere to the new norms of life in the ghetto, everyone has to have the same amount of food, no matter what. And so when she transgresses, when she steals a spoonful of noodles or she eats the honey, she is violating the moral order, which of course is a different moral order than how it must have been before the war, but it is the moral order now. And then she suffers. And I think we forget that, suffering and death by starvation is not just about what happens to the body, it's also what happens to the soul, that she cannot help herself. And yet she has to betray her family locked in this impossible dilemma. And then she feels shame and grief over what she's done. And then those consequences reverberate through the entire family. But at the same time, as an adolescent, we can hear how young she sounds. She's blaming herself for everything. I mean, this line knocks me out every time. We would be a happy family if I didn't fight with everybody. It's 1942 in Lodz Ghetto during the Holocaust. There is no world in which this would be a happy family. That is not an option. And yet she doesn't see that. She blames herself. I am at fault for everything. And this kind of black and white thinking, this kind of, and I say it with, not with judgment, but this sort of narcissism of youth, the difficulty that young people have in seeing past their own lives and their own experiences. And so she adds to her own suffering with this inability to have compassion for herself, inability to see the bigger picture. You can see that she believes here her father is not going to forgive her. The very next day, she writes in her diary, I went to my father's workshop and he gave me his soup. After all, a father is always a father. So, she is sort of, toggling back and forth between what feels so real in the moment, so absolute, which then changes the next day and could change back again. So, with the time that we have left, I'm going to try to get 2 more entries in. I might go over an hour. Is that okay? What are you going to say? I've got him right where I want him. Because I want to talk about hope and despair, which is a huge theme that runs through this material, and it's especially important because of Anne Frank and what I said before about how Anne Frank kind of became the voice of hope, right? She was hopeful for humanity, and she was hopeful for herself, and that hope translated into almost a moral imperative, right? That what makes us human is that we never lose hope. Anyone who has faced an existential crisis knows that that is not true. We do lose hope. We hope that we regain our hope. But if you say that holding on to hope is a moral good, then you have to say that losing hope is a moral failing. And I don't think that's what we want to say. I think what we want to say is that hope is shaped in many cases, at least for many of these writers, by external things. Now, maybe some of us have a kind of faith that supersedes that, but certainly not everyone does, and many of these writers didn't. Their hope rose and fell depending on what was happening around them. Warmer weather, an end of deportations, a larger food ration, good news on the radio could cause people's hopes to soar. And they would think, oh, the liberation is coming, it's around the corner. And then the very opposite would happen, no news of our allied forces, or a bad food ration, or the death of a loved one, or a resumption of deportation, and people's hopes would plummet and they would feel that the liberation had receded. The actual date of the liberation didn't change. It was going to happen when it happened, but their perception of the time did change. And all of these diaries are held in this, between these 2 poles, right? The beginning, when their lives changed, whatever that meant, whether that meant going into hiding or fleeing or going into the ghetto, and the end, the liberation, deliverance, which was unknown. When was it going to come? It seemed closer, it seemed farther away, but its date was unknown, and always the writing is held in that tension between those 2 things. So I want to offer a different way of thinking about hope in these diaries, and to do that I'm going to read from the diary of a young woman who was 21, called Elza Binder, who was writing in Stanislavov in the ghetto. And I'm going to read her diary first and then say a word about how she thinks about hope in a way that I think is perhaps more useful to us than the way that we're accustomed to thinking about it. So this is Friday, January 30th, 1942. Elza had a younger sister called Dora, and she lived with her parents in, as I said, in Stanislavov. And as you're hearing this entry, just bear in mind the urgency with which she's writing about hope, the deliverance, that it's January of 1942. And deliverance did not come until May of 1945. So it was very, very, very far away, much farther than she could have ever imagined. When fear crawls out in the evenings from all 4 corners, when the winter storm raging outside tells you it is winter and that it is difficult to live in the winter, when my soul trembles at the sight of distant fantasies, I shiver and say one word with every heartbeat, every pulse, every piece of my soul: liberation. In such moments, it hardly matters where it is going to come from and who will bring it, so long as it's faster and comes sooner. Doubts are growing in my soul. Quiet. Blessed be he who brings good news, no matter from where, no matter to where. Time, go ahead. Time which carries liberation in its unknown tomorrow. Not for Tzippi, who is happy to live in interesting times. Maybe not for me, but for people like me. The result is certain. Down with any doubts. Everything comes to an end. spring will come. So, when we talk about hope in these diaries, most writers, Anne Frank or any of the other writers really, when they write about hope, they're talking about hope for their own survival, right? They're talking about their chances to live to the liberation and the hope that the circumstances will remain in such will align themselves in such a way that they will be liberated. But Elza's talking about something else. Elza says, time carries liberation in its unknown tomorrow. That is, liberation will come. Maybe not for me, but for people like me. She is asserting her faith in a world that will right itself, that there is such a thing as good, there is such a thing as right, and sooner or later it will return, even if she doesn't live to see it. And I believe that that is the transcendent kind of hope and faith that we think we're talking about, that we want to talk about, that is incredibly difficult to have. And here is this young woman who's able to see that greater vision of what the liberation really means. Even if it's not for her, it will be for someone. And the world will go back to being the way that it is meant to be. And I think in dark times, and I personally believe that we are in dark times and about to enter some dark times, those words are very comforting to me. So finally, I want to talk about resistance. Because I said at the beginning that, writers wrote themselves into existence in some kind of way, right? They literally, some of them forgot to write their names down, but they literally made their mark on the world. And for those whose diaries survived, they left this record. And not everyone, some were explicit about it. Some said very clearly what their diaries were for and how they understood them. Other writers didn't, There's a diary of a boy called Otto Wolff who wrote over 3 years in the forests outside of Olomouc in the Czech lands in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, who never referred to his diary in his diary. He wrote over 1,000 entries. But he and his family were in hiding, and he accounted for where they were in the world in excruciating detail almost every single day. And that in and of itself is a form of resistance. It's a way of saying we will not be erased. We will not disappear. I will create this record. And it was so important, it was so well understood as such, that when 3 weeks before the end of the war, Otto was caught in a roundup and taken away, his sister picked up the diary and finished it and wrote it through those next 3 weeks until the liberation. So I want to read an entry that I think does give us some of that explicit sense of what a diary can represent for these writers. One of the writers who did say, had this vision, and again, I want to take you back to this idea of, the diary as a private document. For some of these writers, it was a public record. It was a testimonial. It was a testament. It was a way of documenting something for the future and for the record, and that is present all over in these diaries. It's not always there in everyone's. Some writers said they were writing for themselves or for very personal reasons, but others declared this more ambitious, not more ambitious, this more public purpose, let's say. So this is written by a young woman, 17 years old, called Alice Ehrman. She was the daughter of a non-Jewish woman and a Jewish man. She was writing in the Theresienstadt ghetto over the last year of the war. And in the diary, she says, she refers to you. The you that she's talking about is Zev Shek, who was the man that she loved. And she's describing the destruction of the clearing of the urn chamber. And just to explain what that means so that it makes sense, 30,000 people had died of illness or disease or hunger or starvation in Theresienstadt. Their bodies had been cremated and they had been stored, their remains ashes had been stored in these little cardboard boxes. And by the time it was November of 1944, of course, everyone knew that the Germans were going to lose the war. It was only a matter of time. The Red Army was coming, of course, from the east, the Allies were coming from the west, and the Germans began to try to bury the traces of what they had done, burning documents, carting things away. She documents this in the diary. And one of the things that they did was to require the Jews in the ghetto to take these ashes, create a human chain, and pass them along and then dump them in the Eger River as a way of hiding the bodies of the dead. So this is November 1st, 1944. The urn chamber is being cleared. 30,000 urns, 30,000 cardboard boxes, 30,000 remains of people, mothers, children, loved ones. What is the point? More importantly, it is the knowledge that dead witnesses, substance is being destroyed, and we are the witnesses. We who still live, I and you, my sister, and all those who are gone. It is not a technical problem, but I cannot imagine it, and still I am afraid to admit that I have understood it. And still I go to work in the morning, will eat, sleep, wash my hands, brush my teeth, maybe even laugh. I will not think about it, but it will inform all my thoughts. Perhaps everything will grow quiet, and it will retreat into the background, and I will be permitted to not think once again. Or will it grow so huge that all my thoughts end in it, even my life and my time, until I myself come to an end in it? Oh, my mother and you, am I afraid? I will read Faust and Isaiah and Jeremiah, and I will try to bear written witness as best I can so that it will survive me. That is what occupies my thoughts. Not to have the world take notice of me, not to say there was one who was beautiful and smart and open to the world, and she was 17 and was snuffed out before her life could even start. No, to say to the world in time what was accomplished here, to read to them a chapter out of the Gola, dated 1944. I think that for a long time, the way we've understood diaries is that their role is to have the world take notice of the individual, right? She was 17, she was snuffed out before her, and she's saying it's something more than that. It's to write to them a chapter out of this history. It is to leave a record of what occurred from the vantage point of someone who was there. And this line was so important for me in Salvaged Pages because it helped me make that shift and to think about these records, not only, of course, as memorials, they are to some extent, and there's nothing wrong with that, but they also have this other capacity that I think is our greatest strength, really, as educators, to help our students learn how to read them and understand the history as these young people recorded them. Not symbolic records, but actual literal records that really shape the way we understand the past. So I'm going to close. I will just make a super brief infomercial for the educational resources that are available for Salvaged Pages. You can find them on my website. It's just my name, alexandrazapruder.com. There's a tab for Salvaged Pages, and underneath it you can find information about the book. You can find information about the documentary film. You can find information about there's a multimedia version of the book that has tons and tons of visual records in it, and then there are educational resources that Jim mentioned. There's lesson plans, there's a finding aid for finding diaries on various topics in the book. It's all fairly self-explanatory, and I hope that for those of you who want to use this book, you'll go over there and check it. It's all available for free and easy to download. So I'm going to leave you with two last thoughts. I think we can probably agree, regardless of our politics, that we are not living in the most humane of times, the most humane version of America. We have a really hard time seeing each other, and we are prone to reductive tropes and shorthand for defining each other, which are habits that limit our capacity to see each other's humanity. And our students are also living in that same world. And one of the things about these diaries, and what I love about diaries as a source, is that that they allow us to get inside the particular humanity of a particular person who can be totally different. And none of these writers are anything like any of us. They're from a completely different world. And yet we find a common language. We find something about their experiences that we can understand, even if we don't relate to it. We can find some meaning in it that makes sense for us. And so I think that helps us to stretch our limits. That is a practice that is good for us and for our students. And I hope that your students will be able to do that and find, and develop and cultivate that practice of seeing the humanity in other people. And then finally, I think it's really important not to let your students forget that these are their peers. These are not adults. These are teenagers. And these teenagers documented their lives, and we understand the historical past because of what they wrote. So many kids feel powerless. They really do feel powerless in this very big world. I think a lot of teenagers think nobody cares what they think or what their experiences are. They feel that the forces are too big for them to account for anything or to stand in any way. And yet, here are these diaries that these one individual after another, they observed the world around them, they described what they saw, they reflected on their experiences, and they, in a deep and important way, I think, validate for other young people that what they think as young people matters. Not just to wait to grow up and be a historian, or wait to grow up and be a writer, or wait to grow up and have something to say, but to say it now. And I really encourage you to encourage them to make their mark, to help empower them to find what they have to say and to help them say it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, that was really wonderful, Alex. Thank you so much for telling us about your book and reading those selections from it. Here in the audience, we have a number of the teachers who are in our courses right now. I'm teaching a course that coincides with the conference, and some of you are here in the auditorium, some of you are online, or at least you better be, because it's a requirement for the class. But so you've experienced the book. We also had a group of faculty at the college who read and discussed parts of the book, and one of my colleagues, Dr. Marilyn Sullivan-Cassetti, pointed out the other day that every teacher should know about this book, regardless of what subject they teach. I think that not only for what you learn about the Holocaust and the experience of young people during that time, but because of what you can learn about the power of writing, and that even in the most extreme circumstances where you feel you have very little power, to write down your story is to take some power, to gain power. And all of our students need to have that skill. And so I hope the book continues to be used here in this area and also around the country. And if you are a teacher listening, I would just remind you that part of the mission of our center is to support teachers in using resources that help to teach the Holocaust more effectively. And we're happy to be a resource for you. We just learned the other day that we are going to again receive a grant that will allow us to continue what we call the Educating the Educators program, where local teachers take courses with us free of charge, a series of 3 courses, 9-credit graduate courses. So we're very fortunate to have that funding, and our first cohort is finishing their program this session, this semester, and we'll start a new cohort in the spring. So I hope that we can continue this. I look forward to continuing this process. Now, for those of you who would like a copy of the book, if you don't have one yet, Alex has agreed to sign copies. She'll be out in the lobby, and we actually have some free copies to give away today. And also, you're all invited to attend a reception around the corner to the right in the Johnson Room, where we can talk more about what we learned today. And just a reminder, too, that this is the opening session of a 3-day conference. The conference will continue all day tomorrow and Tuesday, and it wraps up Wednesday morning. All the sessions will be held on the main campus at Sicilian Hall. So I hope to see you there at the rest of the events in the conference. So thank you all for being with us today.